So before we do formally get started, just a quick note to all the audience that we're recording this event so that it will be available to view again on the festival website at a later date. And I'd also just like to ask that the audience keep their microphones muted while the discussion is underway. There will be time at the end for questions though. So welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Rebecca Andrew, a lecturer in Historic Landscapes and Environments at the University of Chester, and I'll be chairing this event. Thank you all so much for joining us today for one of the final events of this year's Chester Heritage Festival. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, there have been some fantastic talks, walks and activities. And I know our students have thoroughly enjoyed the hands-on book conservation down at the cathedral that's been going on recently. This evening, though, we want to take you on a much broader journey as we try to think about Chester's place in the wider world. And I'll say a bit more about the project that forms the focus of today's event in a moment. But first, let me introduce our lovely speakers, who are all members of the University of Chester. I'll get them to each give us a wave awkwardly on camera as I mention their name. So we have Dr. Katherine Wilson. Wave, Katherine. Thank you. Dr. Tom Pickles. Dr. Hannah Ewence. Professor Tim Grady. Dr. Sam Chadwick, and our wonderful filmmaker, Phil Hirst.
Hello.
Thank you all for waving, not too awkwardly. So our speakers today are going to discuss different aspects of Chester's past, placing it into a wider global history. Now, the city has, of course, been shaped by global trends, but too often its history has been framed by a more provincial narrative, the story of a medieval and modern English country town at the interface with Wales and Ireland. Now, the historians and archaeologists in our department specialise in everything from prehistory to the present across Britain, continental Europe and America. But in the midst of the pandemic and multiple lockdowns, they found themselves very much removed from their usual subject matter. So we challenged them to uncover the global history on their doorsteps. And the result has been a series of short films that highlight moments in the city's past when Chester both contributed to and was shaped by global trends. And they really are a wonderful watch. If you haven't seen them yet, they're all available under the series title, A Global History in One City. I'm sure someone will pop the link in the chat shortly. There are currently 4 films on the site, but more are being filmed right now, not quite at this moment as Phil's in the room with us, but stay tuned for more on their way. But for this Chester Heritage Festival event, we wanted to grill in a nice way all of those involved in making the series and ask them to reflect on the process so far. So please do save up your questions to ask at the end of the event, which you can do via either the chat function or by raising your virtual hand. All of those functions should be at the bottom of your screen. But now we'll turn to our panellists and the discussion. So we start with the first theme of visitors to Chester, which is a theme that kind of runs through quite a few of our films, and a question for Tim. So Tim, your film tells us about 2 Germans who died during the First World War and ended up being buried in Overley Cemetery. After watching your film, the first big question that comes to mind were, what were these Germans actually doing in Cheshire in the first place? After all, this is a long way from the Western Front.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and good afternoon, good evening to everybody else. That's a really good question. Yeah, there's actually 2 people I mentioned in the film, a man called Rudolf Noack and a man called Walter Zich. And I think actually when you look at these 2 people, they kind of illustrate how and why Germans were in Chester during the First World War, how they ended up in Chester. Now, this first guy, Noack, he kind of, I guess, is most straightforward. He was a German soldier, captured on the Western Front, and then brought over to Britain, probably on a ship over to Southampton and then on train from there. Once he's captured, once he's brought to Britain, he was brought to the Handforth prisoner of war camp in East Cheshire, one of the largest POW camps in the country. And I think he was taken ill at some point and brought to Chester to the infirmary in the city. And it was there that he sadly died. He may well have been working either in a sub-camp or on a farm locally, because a lot of the prisoners in Hamforth, if they were taken ill, they would have been taken to a hospital in Manchester. So it's likely he was perhaps already quite close to the city. So that is the most obvious reason. It explains why why he came to Chester and why other prisoners were too. The other guy explains the other side of the story, and that's this man, Walter Zich. He's a bit more complicated. He was a civilian. He lived in Britain since about 1910, I think. One of over 50,000 Germans living in Britain. When the war started, he and these other German civilians were gradually interned, locked up through 1914, and finally with the Lusitania sinking in 1915. He was taken when he was arrested to Queensferry prisoner of war camp, so just outside of Chester, across the border into Wales. Again, he was taken ill there, brought to Chester Infirmary, the same as Noach, and he also passed away there. And that's how the pair of them ended up in Chester and buried in Chester, because they died in the hospital in the city. I hope that explains that, answers the question there. But thank you.
It's fascinating. Think about the journeys to the city, as well as what people do once they're here. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Tim. So Tom, I really enjoyed watching your film about the Vikings and Chester, and it was a new history for me as a confirmed modernist, but one wonderfully explained, and I learned so much. And one thing that really struck me about your film was it was also about a very different set of visitors to Chester. Could you tell us a little bit more about who came to Chester and why?
Well, the title of the film, isn't it? It's the Vikings with a capital V. But we're actually, as historians, very suspicious of that term. We use it to talk about the period between the 8th and the 12th centuries. And we think of this in global terms as being dominated by the movement of peoples from what's now Scandinavia, from what's now Norway and Denmark and Sweden. And we use that term Viking to cover a whole range of activity that they were undertaking. So there's quite a lot of different people who might have been coming to Chester for different reasons. We think of them as as well, and raiding and trading seem to have gone hand in hand. But there were also conquerors who established kingdoms in Middle Britain and ruled towns in places like Dublin. They're also settlers, so we see quite a lot of migration and settlement in Britain in this period. What are they after? Well, so you can see they're operating around the Baltic Sea as a link between the Islamic East and the Latin Christian West. And they're trading items. They're particularly interested in silver, both from the East and from Western Europe. And these is the biggest silver economy that you could be tapping at this point. What they may be getting in places like Britain and Ireland and in Northern is slaves. And that's one thing that we do think was being traded in traffic. So we've probably got a range of different people who are coming. We know that these raiding and trading bands might set off as elite males traveling out from Scandinavia, but they might bring women with them too. They'd also be bringing animals. But we also know that the migrants are likely to have included female settlers. And we also know that on the process of raiding and trading and migrating, they picked up people from other regions too. So what we think of as the Vikings is sometimes a bit of a motley crew of different types of individuals. It's more of a trade, if you like, an occupation to go Viking than it is of an ethnicity. So the video is really about thinking, what's the traces of evidence that they're for us, and who can we imagine might have been in Chester and what might they have been doing?
Thanks, Thomas. Another really interesting explanation of people who are kind of moving in and around Chester. At the water tower on the medieval city walls, and I was surprised. 19th century. Can you tell us a bit more about who and what was traded and why this made Chester so commercially important?
Okay, well, thanks very much. Yeah, so the film was really about trying to speak to why, or to tell people about Chester as a really important commercial city. For me, for the later Middle Ages in particular, back from that, of course, but so 1300 to 1500. And often overlooked the most important port in the northwest during this time. And that's something that's actually really hard to realize now, and Phil did such a great job of showing how Chester was that port city in that period. And that's obviously because the water from the River Dee has receded now, so we no longer have it as that central port city. And to that water tower, we have boats that are coming in from international destinations, from France, Spain, Germany, and Ireland. And they had to come in and they had to pay those customs and duties on the goods and the objects that they were bringing in. And we have really good records of these in the archives in Chester as well, exactly who's coming in and what they're bringing in and what they were taxed on these goods. So things like furs, skins, wine that comes from Gascony in France as well. And these items, people say, well, they're really important items for use in everyday life and for people in Cheshire and beyond. So merchants, of course, in Cheshire itself were often very much involved in this trade, and they profited from this trade as well, building the residences that we still have the remnants of in the centre of Chester itself, in the Undercross, but also actually in the rooftops of the buildings. We often have the medieval remnants of their residences. So I think Chester is just this, I wanted to tell a story about Chester being a really interesting node in the networks of trade. And for me, it should really be studied much more alongside those European commercial centres that I like to study, that are my basis of study. And I think it needs to be fully appreciated and put back into this commercial and global context.
Great, thank you. And another really fascinating kind of exploration of this hidden history right on our doorsteps. So question then on the theme of visitors is for Phil. Now, these films do a really wonderful job of bringing this history to life, but given that quite a lot of what we're talking about today are histories of absence, it must have been pretty difficult as a filmmaker to actually achieve this. We don't have any archive film footage, sadly, for example, of Vikings roaming through Chester, or even of the Germans here in the First World War. So my question for you then, Phil, is how do you actually go about trying to visualise something on film that was already missing?
Well, you're right. It is often a challenge, but because I've been doing this a fair number of years, you remind yourself not to go into sort of blind panic at the start when you see the script with all these, wonderful ideas and bits of history that need to be represented on screen. And to be honest, it's a perennial problem for all producers because often when you present it with a blank, script, as it were, with no visuals attached to it, you do need to do something with it. Otherwise, you've got a blank screen, or you've got lots of black elements on the screen, as it were. So, obviously, the first part to be in is to break it down into chunks and decide which bit the presenter will present, where they can be on screen, of course. And often this needs to be sort of spaced out across the duration of this very short mini documentary, and then decide how best to actually cover these other elements, which might be filled with archive footage or archive photographs or stills, and indeed which bits might be, for instance, aerial shots, and which bits are we going to film with the presenter walking through the shot. So it's often helped, obviously, if you have a budget and you have a large team, but because we're working with a very small budget, in fact, a negligible budget and a very small team, often it was just myself and presenter, it did make it easier in some respects because there's no complications of communication between the group. But what we couldn't do, of course, I couldn't actually call upon the service of somebody else to actually make something happen. We had between the parents, we had to make it happen on the spot, and often it's quite frustrating when you're filming outside, because Chester being quite a lively city, these helicopters and planes and people and children screaming in the background. So can I just applaud everybody for being quite patient while we're filming. But because we're dealing with a documentary narrative here, and we all watch these on the box every single night, we've got a combination of a presenter, contributors, you know, other experts. For instance, in Tom's film, it was Liz in the museum as the curator. Then we've got archive, like I mentioned, we've got reconstruction. And in the Viking one, Tom's film, we had the opportunity, because of the reputation the Vikings have got, we had to supercharge that with a bit of action footage. Unfortunately, because I've filmed that sort of stuff before and I know where to go and find it, we had the opportunity to pull some of that footage in just to dramatise it a bit. With Tim's, of course, that was a more reflected and muted sort of topic. So therefore, we didn't have to work as hard. But one of the challenges there was the fact that we didn't have a single picture of either of these soldiers. Unfortunately, Tim had managed to actually find some documentation where we had the names, so that helped a bit. And the other thing that Tim helped, he found a piece of propaganda, a pamphlet that was published during the First World War, telling the story of all these German soldiers that were being held in concentration camps in Britain. So that helped us to get through that problem. But the real thing is getting the balance right. And because the script and the program comes together on the timeline on the computer, you can see where the gaps are, and you can work on the bits that need the attention. The rest of it will actually look after itself. But often you go with the gut feel, and the objective, of course, is to make it visually interesting, but interesting in a sort of soundscape sort of way. So often music is very powerful in often filling the gaps or creating that mood underneath to get you through to the next point. But what we haven't got the luxury of is actually spending too much time. They have to be quite short, not as long as obviously a full broadcast documentary where you're looking at an hour or so. And that was a sort of a difficulty, because we need to keep it short so we don't lose people's attention span. But also, if we make it too short, then we don't do justice to the story. So it's trying to get that balance that right, that weighing up, and obviously hoping that people actually run with the material and actually, you know, decide to actually find out more by hopefully coming to Chester and sort of seeing what wonderful history we've got to share with people.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think you did a great job on all of that kind of myriad of pulling it all together, Phil. And I really love some of the, I'm guessing there were drone shots over
yes.
some of the sites that you looked at. I think that was great. But we're also learning about a hidden history, perhaps, of filmmakers' secrets this evening. So what a great start to our discussions this evening. Thank you all who've emerged from these films, that of memory. Now, if I think about the films as one collective, what really stands out is the work of memory. And these films really made me wonder why some events and some individuals have been remembered while others ignored. So Hannah, you explored the life of Viscount Combermere, but above all, his deeds were remembered. But above all, really, it was about how his deeds were remembered by the people of Chester. And this was shown in your film most visibly with the statue of him, which is situated by the Grosvenor Bridge. So I wondered if you could tell us a little about who erected this statue and what it actually tells the public about his life.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think statues are, of course, so important, aren't they, for telling us something about the moment in which they were erected, but also they're so important as a source of memory and reckoning with the history and how that can change over time. The statue was put up by the people of Chester, and it was put up, even though the idea was already in play at the end of his life to erect this statue. Momentum for it really picked up after his death, and the people of Chester contributed to it. They gave money to help put this up, and I think we need to put that in the context of what was very much a Victorian frenzy almost for putting up statues and monuments. And if we think of many of the different statues that we have in Chester today, we can really relate them back to that Victorian period. And then I think Viscount Combermere's statue really speaks to the value of the age, which was about celebrating military endeavour It was about celebrating imperial expansion, about loyalty to the crown, all of these great values, about Britishness as well, and all of that encased in the figure of a man, an elite figure as well, an aristocrat ultimately. So I think we can see many of these values being encapsulated in this statue. And for the people of Chester, it was also about wanting to have a piece of that, wanting to make that local connection between this great man who stood on the world stage and their own immediate landscape, their own immediate environment that they felt had given rise to his prestige. So I think that's a really important way of thinking about it. But I think when we try to reflect perhaps on what the public might make of his statue since that point, I think that really changes over time, and it goes to show the way that this statue has somewhat blended into the landscape, almost to the point of becoming invisible. That shows how our perception of this man have changed over time, but also our attitude towards the values that he seems to represent as well. You know, that for many people, even by the early 20th century, they've forgotten who he was. They've forgotten his importance to the Victorians, and now really it's come full circle, and that statue is part of a contested heritage, particularly linked to colonialism. So it's really a public figure, but more than that, it's ultimately what that statue represents.
Great, thank you. So really important and timely point. So now, Tim, after watching a really quite moving film,
I think Rebecca's internet might have frozen. Shall I try to take? Oh yeah, you're back.
I apologise of all the times.
Okay.
Wonderful technology. So I was thinking, Hannah, thank you very much for your timely points there. I don't know when I was really cut off by BT Internet. But I was then moving on to speak to Tim about his really quite moving film about the two Germans that he featured. But I was still a bit unsure about what had actually happened to them. And at one stage you discussed they're buried with headstones, but then further on in the film we learned that their graves were actually lost. So my question for you is, were they actually remembered in Chester or not?
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, that's a good question that I got the second time round there, so thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, to be honest, I'm not sure they were ever fully remembered in Chester, but they certainly had a presence in Chester because their bodies were here and potentially still are here. The fact that they're war dead and technically, or at least one of them was technically a soldier, or was a soldier, so was technically war dead, meant that they couldn't simply be forgotten and totally ignored. They had this presence, they were here, and to some extent they had to be remembered. So we know the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the Imperial War Graves Commission as it was back then, was very good at securing the British and Empire war dead. And when you go into Overley Cemetery, for example, right-hand side there, you see quite a small war graves cemetery for the British and Empire war dead there. Now, for the Germans, under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, one paragraph within that says that enemy war dead have to be buried properly and their graves maintained as well. So the Commonwealth War Graves Commission had a responsibility to do this. And I think, as far as we can tell, they did do this because various reports, a 1930 German report, for example, states that the two graves in Chester were excellently maintained. So we get a sense that they were remembered and maintained. But thereafter, this is where it becomes a bit of a mystery, and hence your question, I guess, is what really happens to them. And the problem comes early 1960s. West Germans at that point were allowed to move their dead from World War I and from World War II to a new cemetery at Cannock Chase. And these two members, these two men I've mentioned in Chester, were on the list to be exhumed and moved at that point. but I'm not sure that they ever were moved to Cannock Chase. They're listed to be moved, but I don't think they actually make that journey to Cannock. Because today, if you look at their names on the registers, they're listed as missing, unknown graves. And instead it says to look at the register instead. Thereafter, the last correspondence I find about them says that, okay, we don't need these graves anymore. The headstones could be knocked down and demolished, which seems to suggest they've been exhumed somewhere, but exhumed to where, I've no idea. So it ends as a bit of a mystery. And that's all I really know on that. But if anybody can help me fill in the gaps, I'd be more than grateful. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think it's absolutely intriguing. Hopefully, one day perhaps you'll find out what happens to them and whether they are remembered here or elsewhere. I'm going to stop my video for a moment. I will carry on talking, don't worry, just to see if it stabilises my internet connection a little bit. So we'll move on then from Tim's very moving example of memory and perhaps the absence of memory there, to ask my final question on the theme of memory to a panellist whose film is currently in the works. Sam, you're going to cover in your film the English Civil War and military revolution in general by looking at the Siege of Chester. So my question for you is just a very small one for today's panel. Who makes it into the history books? Who do you think should be remembered? And who isn't?
So Chester, because it's a royalist stronghold, ends up getting visited by the big important people, the ones that we remember: King Charles, his nephew Prince Rupert, the big royalist commanders. Might be a stretch of it, but people who take charge of the army. But in our local history books, the two names that we see continually are William Brereton and Byron. Byron is the defender of Chester. They are both archetypical of their sides. Byron is languorous, lazy, beautifully spoken. He is a royalist who knows what he's talking about, is a better person than all the rest of us, and lets other people get on with things. And doesn't do a very good job, but does it with an awful lot of style. Brereton, however, is very meritocratic in his things. He's very pernickety. He's the sort of person you do not want to get stuck with in a pub. He writes out all of his correspondence twice afterwards, which is brilliant for us as historians, because it means I've got letter books to go through afterwards and look through all the correspondence of letters he both received and wrote. However, you get the idea from the writing that he is just tedious and unimaginative. It's very chalk and cheese between the two of them. Obviously, the people that we don't really hear from, because while writing's getting in there and publications are getting in there, the printing press is around, we don't hear much from the people, from the common people of Chester. Though we do get a beautiful one from when the wall is broken. So at the Roman Gardens, there is a big break in the wall, and after hours of gunfire, the parliamentarians siege him, assault him, and to start off with, it's just the soldiers fighting, but then we have reports of the women of the city of Chester start making the soldiers look bad for fighting back so terribly and pushing the parliamentarians back. Along with them, there is also one Frenchman who is a friend of one of the nobles. He's a low-level noble who is fighting in his nightshirt, nearly as naked as his sword, which I think needs to have more of his life. You know, I'd like to know more about him.
I think there was a lot in there, Sam. Thank you for a really vivid kind of discussion of the period you're looking at and what we hopefully can expect to see in your film when it's finished. You also did a good job of tackling such a large topic in a really short space of time. So lots to look forward to there with your film. So we move on now to the penultimate theme for today's panel to consider: material culture. And if these global histories that you've all been looking at have been hidden, one of the things that's occurred to me while I've been watching them is how you actually went about as historians uncovering these hidden histories. From several of the films, the key to learning more about them seems to come from surviving objects. So my first question is for Katherine. When watching your film, I was really excited to hear about Chester's connection to the silk trading route through the hair tile found in Chester. And it's such an unusual story. Could you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking about material culture and objects, I should probably confess now that 2 years of archaeology at Glasgow University before I transferred to history, which has given me my interest in material culture all the way, although I transferred to history in the end. So this tile is a part of Chester's story in the Middle Ages. As I said in the film, it was excavated from the nave of Chester Cathedral about 1996. The tile itself is from the 14th century, and it shows these 3 hares or rabbits. We can debate over whether it's a hare or a rabbit, and they are interlocked by their ears. And it's, when you're looking at it, it's a visual riddle or puzzle, because you've got 3 ears of the animal on the tile, but each animal is sharing an ear, and I've stared at it for a lot, confused every time. So where does this motif come from, however? We think it was inspired by designs possibly on silk textiles that are imported into Western Europe through China, and this is because the original motif is actually found in the caves dating from the 6th centuries. It's and temples at Dunhuang in China. And this motif is really interesting because it then starts moving, and we have instances of where we see it moving. So we find this design on a Mongolian coin in the 13th century, and then it starts popping up in churches across Europe. So sometimes it's on tiles, sometimes it's on roof bosses, on churches themselves. But like Tim's answer earlier, there's still a bit of a mystery here to be solved with this one. Susie Field said that the mystery of the rabbit's journey is yet to be solved. Don't know fully how this motif is transferred. And in fact, Persia has been another suggestion of the motif's origin. So again, if anybody wants to help out with this one, I'd be very willing to hear about it. But whatever the origins of this design, it's clear that this motif is traveling thousands of miles, quite possibly from east to west. And this shows I think the nature of what was trying to get at in the film of Chester itself, how in the Middle Ages it's a place full of objects, and how these things travel, objects travel boundaries. And this tile and other objects in the Grosvenor Museum that show this mobility across boundaries or across the globe is going to be part of an exhibition next year with the Grosvenor Museum at the end of April in 2022. So look out for it there. You can come and have a look at the tile in greater detail too.
That's great, thank you. I will definitely be popping around and down to look at that tile. Absolutely fascinating. So now, Tom, I feel like saying now onto something completely different. Chester's Roman history is still very visible in the city today, and material remains still frequently pop up in archaeological excavations, but you take us on a very different path and explore the history of Vikings. What role does material culture play in our understanding of this history?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think I should start by saying on the blog that accompanied the film, I talked about the 2 very brief glimpses we get from texts from written sources. Both of these are from sources from the outside, looking in on the Vikings, from the English speakers in Lowland Britain and from Ireland. And one is from much later. And they describe for us the activities of unnamed Vikings attacking Chester, and another tells us about a warrior, Ingemund, who's left Dublin and is coming settle probably on the Wirral, and then attacks Chester himself unsuccessfully. The question for us always is, what lies behind these glimpses that we get? And the material culture is really crucial across the Viking diaspora, the areas where we get Scandinavian activity, for identifying the people who are at work across those regions. So I can think of two ways from the material I was looking at in the film. One is that it's really important, just at a basic level, for identifying the presence of Scandinavians. Now, how do we do that? We look for the distribution and forms, the decoration on particular objects. So I talk about Hiberno-Norse ring-headed pin in the film. And these are pins which originate from a form in Ireland, are adapted to Scandinavian tastes. And if you look at the distribution is very widespread, corresponds to those areas where we've got Scandinavian. So it seems as if they're picked up as part of this process of interaction. And I also talked about a brooch, a yelling brooch, which was shown to us at the Grosvenor Museum. And Montgomery explained that the form and the style of that brooch is Scandinavian, but its twin is found in Dublin, and it may well have been produced in Dublin. And the crucial aspect for us is, this isn't just an item of fashion. The way in which people dress was a fundamental aspect of their bodily identity. So it's really about the way in which you actually operate the brooch. And we know these are used by Scandinavian instinctively. They're different from Scandinavian influenced brooches, which are of a form that we find in Britain. So this looks like something that comes from probably a female Scandinavian in there. So there's identifying Scandinavians, but there's also figuring out what they were up to. And here I talked in particular with Liz about a hoard, the Castle Esplanade hoard. How do these hoards help us identify Scandinavians and figure out what they're doing? Well, the regions of Western Europe, we know them now as France and Germany, as England. These were monetized regions. They had controlled silver coinages issued in the name of the king. But beyond those were areas where there weren't monetized economies. There weren't coins issued in the names of kings. And the Vikings were operating between these. And then there are areas where silver was really not abundant at all, like Ireland. And what these hoards show is they show people who are traveling around with silver bullion in nice bars, but also hack silver jewelry that they can hack up. And they often, in graves, we find Scandinavians buried with weights and little weighing scales so that they can weigh out the hack silver that they've acquired to make it up to the right value. Also then mixtures of coins, not from any one denomination, from any region. Sometimes there'll be a mix of some Eastern Islamic coins. Sometimes there'll be Frankish coins from what's now France and Germany. Sometimes there'll be English coins, and sometimes of different periods in time too. And that helps us see these individuals who are traveling around with different types of silver to operate in different kinds of economies and operate between them. And why are they putting them in the ground? This is a very good question. But in the ground as, if you like, war chests to be retrieved at some, and some of the ones we've got, and we have quite a lot of these now, we just never reclaimed. So they show us about the connection between raiding and trading as well.
Absolutely fascinating. Thanks, Tom, for that answer. And it was really great on your film to see some of those objects in the Grosvenor hold as well. So moving on to Hannah, obviously the sizable object at the centre of your film is Viscount Combermere's statue. And as we know, statues, especially those which link a person or a place to colonialism and slavery, have become increasingly controversial in Britain and around the world. So what do you think should be the future of this particular statue?
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it? And it's one that, of course, Britain as a whole, and I think different global communities, different nations are having to deal with as well, particularly those that have got imperial pasts or who are themselves the descendants of colonial people. Trying to grapple with this is really complicated. I think from my point of view, in Chester, Combermere's statue actually serves quite an important function, because it's really arguably the sole remaining object which truly speaks to Chester's links to the slave trade, and the broader entanglement of the city and the people in imperialism more broadly. There are other links that we know about, we can see within the historical records. There are other sites which we know about which are really important, like the port, for example. We know that there were a small number of ships that were built in Chester and that departed from Chester that completed the full triangle, sailing out to Africa with goods to trade for slaves, then taking them on to plantations in the Caribbean and in the Americas, and then returning with various goods for the domestic market, including sugar. And we know that there were various sugar refineries in Chester as well that processed that load being brought in. But those sites are all but vanished. Of course, we still have evidence of Chester's port, although of course it doesn't exist in the same way that it did at that moment in time. It's been quite fundamentally redeveloped, and this link to slavery has been all but forgotten. And I think it's partly because that site itself has been somewhat erased from the city's landscape. And we've lost those buildings that those sugar refineries were housed in. We've lost many of the records. These were often small-scale businesses, and it's very, very hard to try to trace them back. So it's not part of a known history. But what we do have with Combermere's statue is some tangible evidence. I think it's how we then deal with that evidence, how we deal with that piece of material culture that still remains in our city's public spaces, which is important here. I think it's important to use this statue to make clear that what he stood for, particularly those links to slavery and being a plantation owner, are no longer the values that represent our modern society. So of course we need to contextualize that statue. We need to place it within an important historical context and symbolically remove him from that pedestal. So it's no longer a figure that we are celebrating, but rather an object instead of historical value for what it tells us about a past society. So for me, I think actually I wouldn't necessarily campaign to remove it altogether, but I would certainly want it placed in a clear historical context.
That's great, thank you so much. And obviously this is part of a far bigger conversation that we'll see over the next few years, I expect. And there's a lot of food for thought there in your answer. Thank you so much, Hannah. So we now move on to our final theme for our panel, space and place, one that's very close to my own heart and research interests. And such an important part of these films are, as Phil touched on a little bit earlier, the spaces and places that are so beautifully captured in and around Chester, bringing to light its multi-layered and global past. So a question for Phil. Each film has so many spaces and places within them. Is there one in particular that stands out for you? And if so, why?
Can I just say that Chester, because it is so, and it's a cliche to say this, it's so aesthetically pleasing to look at often, you know, the main parts of the city, the historic bits that get lots of photography expended on them, because it's so beautiful. You're often spoilt for choice, but if I had to choose one, then it would be the River Dee, and that is for me because it's often overlooked by many people, and in fact sometimes myself when I go to town I fail to go down to the river and just sort of, you know, experience the wonderful landscape that we have down there. And what I often find is that when it's a very hot day, sunny day, that everybody, well not everybody, almost everybody seems to gravitate down towards the river. It's either teenagers jumping in the water, or it's people going for a kayak like myself sometimes, or people actually going out on the boat. So I think from a visual point of view, what makes it so attractive and tantalizing, because it's tidal, certainly up to the old Dee Bridge, so therefore it's always changing, there's always something being uncovered and revealed. And when I came to do the aerial shots, the drone obviously revealed that wonderful sweeping snaking part of the river that you know, passes through Chester, through the centre of Chester, and goes off up to Holt, but also down towards you know, where it becomes canalised and out towards the estuary. So it's very aesthetically pleasing. But another aspect of this would be, in a narrative sense, the river is incredibly significant, and it has been throughout history. So you could argue the Romans wouldn't have come to Chester, wouldn't have chosen this spot without having access to the sea. So they could actually either attack or transport goods and get to other parts of the province in Britain. And of course, as the empire was failing slightly, the Chester was being attacked by Irish pirates and maybe even Saxon raiders. So the river again is part of that rich narrative. And then obviously into the medieval period, which is dealt with by Catherine's film, obviously the river was still significant, even though towards the latter part it was starting to silt up. So it helped to build Chester into this bustling, you know, medieval town. And quite as late as the, I think, 18th century, there's still some shipbuilding that was ongoing on the banks of the River Dee. So for all those reasons, the river, I find, is one of the most attractive and you know, enigmatic parts of Chester that I always find myself gravitating towards.
Absolutely love that answer, for lots of different reasons, as you've quite wonderfully pointed out. Thank you, Phil. So my final question for the panel goes to you, Sam. As the historian responsible for one of the hotly anticipated films to be released shortly, can you give us a bit of a teaser about the spaces and places in Civil War Chester that will feature in your film, and explain why they're so important?
Okay, yeah, so my film is going to be looking at the military revolution and then how it can be seen in Chester or not seen in Chester. And the idea is that your organised armies with big weapons should be knocking down places like Chester within seconds. It all starts in Constantinople over a century beforehand, often considered sort of the end of the medieval period after the early modern period, although controversial. I'll be careful on those ones, where the walls fall down straight away. But at Chester, you get loads of places where the walls don't. Well, they do have the breach that is at Roman Gardens, and is one of the ones that I think we'll have a look at. That is only after a year of pounding that wall. And if you go down along the Roman Gardens, down to Barnaby's Tower at the end, you can actually still see the cannonball marks where they've hit it and they're just bounced off. So we've got lots of places which actually kind of demonstrate the resilience of Chester. Although my personal favourite little bit is actually just by the university. There is Prince Rupert's Trench, which until recently didn't even have any notifications on it, and people had not really known what it was. And it was only silly archaeologists and historians go, oh yeah, that's a early modern fortification. That's where Prince Rupert has come to town, has seen this vast defences that are way too big for the Chester garrison to defend, and funny enough, protect all the rich homes. I don't know what correspondence there is there. And then Prince Rupert comes down, cuts it all down into this neat fighting force that then holds out for a long time.
Great, so I will have to go and have a look at those cannonball marks down at the gardens this weekend. I really can't wait to watch the finished product. Well, I'm sure the audience will agree with me. What a fascinating and thoroughly enjoyable that discussion that was, and hopefully join me in a round of applause to say thank you so much to our panel. So we've got a little bit of time to take some questions from the audience. So I've noticed that some of you have already been posting your questions. Thanks very much. I'll work my way through them now. But please do post your questions in the chat. Or raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. Okay, so Stuart Shuttleworth asks, I think this is one for you, Sam. You wonder what the ordinary citizen thought of the decision of the city to declare for the king.
So it's actually quite interesting. They a lot of cities, but Chester really hams it up. Is a lot of places go, we don't want to deal with this. You deal with this elsewhere. And so there are these big, from an awful lot of the cities, declarations of neutrality, declarations of do your business somewhere else. We'll talk to whoever wins, and we'll happily have them as our ruler, whether it's Parliament or whether it's King. And indeed, they even start, the actual local government actually starts building up the defences of Chester even before they've decided whether they're going to be parliamentarian or royalist, and with the aim that it would deter armies. Unfortunately, armies quite like well-defended places because it's good for their armies. So, yeah.
Thanks, Sam. So we've got a question that kind of goes across two of the films here. So Jane Hebber-White's asking, Combermere's values quite rightly challenged, but then how do you deal with a societal group's values such as the Vikings?
Yeah, this is a good question. So how do we deal with the values of past societies, the cultural values that we work with? I think what Hannah's talked about is contextualization. So there's a famous judgment by Sawyer on the Vikings who says this is more than normal Dark Age activity. Said a bit tongue-in-cheek, but the argument that he was making is that seeing the Vikings through the eyes of Christians who denounce activities, and his argument was that they were in turn exaggerating what had actually happened, and that the way in which the raiders and conquerors were behaving was no different from the way in which their Christian counterparts were behaving in. So one way of dealing with this is trying to ask through whose lens we are viewing the past, and then asking ourselves through whose lens we're viewing the present as well. So we can use it as a lesson, I think, about how we think about ourselves. Another way of thinking about this is that contextualization of why these values were held and how they interlocked with other aspects of society, which is also a useful question for ourselves. So there's been interesting work on the way in which we're dealing, in fact, with two different cultures of warfare and political behavior. So two different sets of rules of the game, neither one better or worse than the other, one more or less shocking than the other, and not necessarily more or less in which we behave today, but because they intersect in ways which were so familiar to the societies who were operating within them that they seem normalized. There was a huge culture clash when they came together. And that again asks us to reflect on the ways in which there are aspects of our behavior which might seem perfectly normal to us and then suddenly be revealed as very much embedded within our own social and cultural expectations and within a broader set of structures. So that's quite a complicated answer. But I would say we don't need to judge morally necessarily so much as to use this as a mirror on ourselves.
Thanks, Tom. That's yeah, it's really interesting to compare kind of past and current social values. James also pointed out Sam's point that there's a really lovely interpretation panel now at Rupert's Trench. Should anybody want to go and wander down there and have a look at it? Now, I think it's Claire's posted in the chat, and it's a question I actually had for you all. Are there any other topics that you're dying to do for future films?
A really good question. Shall I kick off with that? We have got some others in the pipeline besides Sam's as well. Our American specialist, Donna Jackson, is going to do something about thinking through globalization and Americanization and the impact that has had in 20th century Chester, which I think will be really fascinating. We're also going to have films from some of our archaeologists. So Caroline Pudney, who's a specialist on Roman history and archaeology and prehistory, of course, will be doing, or is in fact already virtually finished, I think, Phil, isn't it? Her film about Roman Chester, which is going to be such a crucial part of this series, of course, but looking to explore in quite a new way what otherwise we might think of as quite a well-known narrative about Chester. And we've also got other films, suggested films as well, from Cara Pritchell, who's going to be thinking about links between Chester and the Holocaust, and refugees from Nazism who found their way to Chester. And then I think you, Rebecca, as well, to put you on the spot, is also giving some thought to how your own research about landscape, but also industrialisation plays out in Chester and the way in which that links through. I don't want to steal your thunder on that.
I'm obviously, as I said earlier, a modern historian, but I'm really interested in the modern history of Chester, which I think to an extent is also quite hidden. So I've been thinking about lots of things, definitely, the other waterway aside from the Dee, like the canal, but also more recently I've been thinking about post-war architecture and the joy of concrete in Chester city centre. So something around that hopefully coming quite soon down the pipeline. But again, especially through its kind of built environment. So the final question I think we've got in the chat then is one for Tim, and it's from Alan Hume. Did First World War hospital ships ever transport prisoners, or were they always max patient loaded? Were the prison ships as an alternative?
Thank you for that. Thank you for those questions there. Yeah. In terms of ships and the transportation of prisoners across the Channel, we know certainly that there's prison ships that were utilised for Allied casualties, Allied wounded that were brought over. I've not seen any evidence that they were also used for enemy prisoners when they were brought across the Channel. What we do know for sure, though, is that within or just off of UK shoreline, that ships were used to hold prisoners for a short period of time. Off of Southend, I think it was 3 ships that were moored off of Southend for a while, and in these German prisoners were kept. But there were Swiss delegations and American delegations that toured all the different places of internment, and they quickly condemned these ships as being not suitable for holding people. They were too cramped, damp, cold, and from that point onwards the British had to find alternative places to hold people. They couldn't hold them in ships over the longer term. So I can partly answer that question but not fully answer it, and that's really all I know off the top of my head of that question, really, but it's an important point you raise.
It's great. Thanks so much, Tim. So really that kind of time is up. It concludes our, hopefully you found it as fascinating as I've today, our fascinating discussion around these 4 films. And there are obviously, as Hannah was saying, many more to come in the pipeline. I posted a link in the chat to an evaluation form, which will honestly, I promise, take you probably a minute or so to fill out. It's very helpful to us for doing more events like this in the future, and we do value your input and feedback. So thank you all for joining us today, and stay tuned for future films from us. And thanks also to our wonderful panel again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.